The doom of Valyria is one of the most consequential events in the history of ice and fire. However, as with all pivotal moments, there are massive ripples that come from its occurrence. And in this alternate timeline, we explore what would happen if the cataclysmic event that destroyed Valyria never happened. If the Dragonlords were able to continue their dominance over the known world for another 500 years, it would be a very different world indeed. Let's get into it. First, let's talk about what a continuous golden age of Valyria might actually look like. What kind of innovations or discoveries would have been made over 500 years? Most fans would probably say Valyrian steel for everyone. And while I personally believe that the technology of Valyria was based around blood magic and would eventually run out of steam, perhaps some of the greatest minds of that age could have created something that we never saw, perhaps even better swords than Valyrian steel. Or maybe more potent spells, bigger dragons, more terrifyingly deadly assassins. Possibilities are really endless here. But perhaps the biggest difference would be the cultural landscape of the known world. Without the destruction of Valyria, you can bet that Valyrian culture, art, societal norms, etc., would have permeated the known world to a much greater degree. We know from the main timeline that even after losing all of their power, isolated pockets of Valyrian culture and people survived in Essos, specifically in the Free Cities, but also with Varys' vast network of spies and informants. They may have had cells throughout Westeros. Their language would have likely become the dominant language of power. And when we see the various languages of power in the main timeline, they are almost all based on High Valyrian, so think about how much more powerful and widespread High Valyrian would have been. Imagine Dorne speaking High Valyrian instead of Andal. Imagine a Low Valyrian spoken across most of the known world. But perhaps the biggest factor would be the culture itself. Valyrian culture was extremely individualistic. It celebrated power and ambition above all else. And many, many powerful families rose and fell over the centuries, often through intrigue, assassination and conquest. The ruling families of Westeros valued duty, honor, tradition, and the realm above all else. And as much as those families loved to fight each other, the idea of banding together to stop a common external threat was always strong enough to unite them. But that common threat was precisely what the Valyrians lacked. That which can corrupt absolutely must be corrupted, and the Valyrian inability to put aside their petty squabbles to deal with a greater threat ultimately led to their downfall. So let's say the doom didn't happen. How would this have played out? First of all, Westeros, under the shadow of a still-standing Valyria, would be an extremely dangerous place. Either the Seven Kingdoms would still be divided, but constantly pressured or attacked by the Valyrians, or they would simply be ruled directly by the Dragonlords. Either outcome would lead to a vastly different political landscape. The Aegon's conquest in the main timeline was a turning point in Westeros' history. It led to the unification of the Seven Kingdoms, but it also led to the destruction of many old houses, and the creation of the great houses that would dominate Westeros for the next 280 years. You could argue that without Aegon's invasion, the North wouldn't have elected to support the Lannisters and Baratheons against the Targaryens, thus leading to the War of the Five Kings. So the Lannister and Baratheon ascents, along with the overall structure of Westeros society, may not have ever happened. Does this mean the Starks would have been elevated to the position of Kings of Winter? Perhaps. They were definitely the most powerful house in opposition to the Targaryen, and there were rumblings that they would claim the Iron Throne after Aegon's death, especially from ambitious members like Littlefinger, who would have advised them to do so. But then we run into an issue. In the show at least, the Starks and their bannermen resisted the Targaryens largely because of the threat posed by the White Walkers. Jon Snow's mission south was expressly to get the help of House Lannister, legitimizing the future war against the dead. Now, this is obviously not the case in the books. The Starks have no such warning, and thus have no reason to ally themselves with the Targaryens. In fact, given the general animosity between the two sides in the show, they would probably be the first to resist any attempt by the Dragonlords to take over the North. And given the resources, manpower and wildling allies at their disposal, they would prove to be a difficult foe. But the magic of the Children of the Forest might not be enough to overcome the might of dragons. The Weirwood network allows for prescience, but it doesn't allow for teleportation, shapeshifting, or invisibility. And even if Bran Stark were to become the Three-Eyed Raven and gain access to the memories of past wargs, it's not clear if that would be enough. The Valyrians had weapons that could destroy armies and entire cities. The Children's magic was more subtle and took time to wield effectively. Now, let's talk about the Iron Throne. In the main timeline, it was literally forged from the swords of the fallen Baratheon kings. But in this timeline, the Baratheons may not even exist, and Aegon I would certainly still be king, perhaps alongside his brothers. So the Iron Throne may just be a relic of a bygone era. Instead of the current Seven Kingdom map, the Seven Kingdoms may be reduced to 6 kingdoms and a dominion of Valyria. And instead of the trident being claimed by House Baratheon, it may be ruled by a Valyrian viceroy, similar to how Dorne was ruled by a viceroy in the main timeline. And now, let's get to the big one. There is no Targaryen dynasty in this timeline. The entire legacy of House Targaryen, Daenerys, Jon Snow, Tyrion Lannister, etc., is gone. This has massive ramifications for the entire story. Dany in particular had a destiny written for her since birth, a prophecy that foresaw her breaking the wheel and becoming a ruler unlike any before. But with no doom, there is no exile for her ancestors, and thus no return to reclaim the throne and restore their bloodline. In fact, if the Valyrians were still in power, there is a good chance that the Targaryens would be among the noble houses elevated to power. After all, they were the most prominent Valyrians, and had the most claim to the title of their drone. The long night in the main timeline was truly horrifying, even though it came 1700 years before the events of the story. Yet the horrors of that night were still keenly felt. Entire generations of men and women died during the long night, along with mammoths, giants, and children. Thousands upon thousands of years of history were lost in a single night. That is why when the others returned, the living were so eager to prevent a repeat of the past. But what if Valyria still existed at this point? I honestly believe that a powerful, magically advanced Valyria would not only have been able to defeat the others, but would have done so without needing the help of the Children of the Forest or the Wall. To get into detail on this, however, would require me to make an entirely new video. So instead, I'll just say that they would have dealt with the others in their own way, which generally meant through conquest and subjugation rather than mercy and understanding. Slavers Bay is still a slaving empire in the main timeline, despite existing within a post-Valyrian world. That means that for at least 2,000 years, slaving was a major institution in the known world. But what if the Valyrians were still around? Would they have abolished slavery or integrated the slavers into their empire? I think they would have done one or both of these things. The Dothraki would almost certainly have been brought into the fold, either as loyal subjects or conquered enemies. And depending on how strongly anti-slavery the still-standing Valyria was, Slavers Bay may have been folded into their dominion, or reformed into something less brutal. The Marinese were skilled shipbuilders and possessed a powerful navy. And while the Dothraki had plenty of horses, they had no navy to speak of. So this would have been a useful acquisition for Valyria. That brings us to our final point, Essos. Without the Doom, it's likely that the free cities would have become true Valyrian outposts, and not merely trading partners. Tyrosh Lys and the rest would have been forced to bend the knee or burn. And if the Valyrians were still expansionist, they would likely have pushed further east, conquering the Summer Isles and possibly even the eastern continent of South Thoros. The Dothraki would have had ample room to roam and conquer, and perhaps they would have carved out a domain for themselves in the Great Grass Sea. That would have been a very interesting development considering the almost constant state of warfare between the Dothraki and the kingdoms of the West. In fact, the Great Grass Sea would have been a very interesting wrinkle in a post-Doom world. With no dragons and no Valyrian steel, the Dothraki hordes would have been nearly unstoppable. I couldn't imagine any kingdom or city being able to withstand the shock cavalry tactics of the Dothraki, not to mention their numbers. If anyone could, however, it would be the still-standing Valyria, and that would have made for a very interesting conflict, a battle of horse versus dragon, of blood magic versus blood and thunder. Now, it's worth exploring the negative side of a continuous golden age. For as long as Valyria stood, the known world would have been stuck in a cycle of conquest and subjugation. Yes, there would have been periods of stability and peace, but there would also have been times of unprecedented violence and horror. Think about how many wars and conflicts the Valyrians caused in their lust for conquest. Now multiply that by 5 or 10 centuries. Additionally, I think that a world where one culture and way of life dominated everything would have been a poorer place. Think about the vibrant cultures of Dorne, the Riverlands, and the Reach. All of those cultures were enriched by their isolation from the rest of the world. But if Valyria had been around, I doubt they would have been allowed to flourish. Perhaps the Doom was a necessary reset for the world, a way to wipe the slate clean and allow for more independent cultures and civilizations to thrive. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing. See you next time.